Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Julian Perez, and I'm the Planning and Zoning Director for the City of Doral. We're here this evening on a community meeting on the Northwest 58th Street corridor, Green Reuse Brownfield Area Designation. This is our second community meeting. The way that the process works is we have at least one community meeting. Then we go to City Council on first reading on the area designation, and we did this last month. And on November 15th, we're going to our second reading of the area designation. At that point, the area gets designated, and all of the Brownfield regulatory and financial incentives are made available, as well as other benefits associated with the program. The area that's going to get designated, as shown in the map, it goes from the corner of Northwest 87th Avenue on 54th Street, all the way north to the intersection of Northwest 87th Avenue and 58th Street, and then we head east all the way out to the Meadow Expressway, and we go down on Northwest 77th Court along 826, then we come down and we go west on Northwest 41st Street, and then we come back again north on Northwest 79th Avenue on the east side, all the way out to the intersection of Northwest 79th Avenue on Northwest 54th Street, and then we head west again on Northwest 54th Street all the way out to Northwest 87th Avenue. In that corridor, we have approximately 260 acres of land, over 220 light industrial and commercial properties located in this general area. Again, I'm going to go ahead and now pass the presentation to Mr. Michael Goldstein, who is the City of Doral's Brownfield consultant. And I just wanted to point out again that the second reading of this item will be on November 15th, and then thereafter the area gets designated, and we move forward. Just like we have with three other areas in the city, one of them being on the 4th district, which is south of this new designation, and then there's the Doral Legacy Park, and also the former FDNF site, which is very close to the police station. All right, and with that, Mr. Goldstein.
Julian, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Goldstein. I am very pleased to be here. Thank you, Director Perez. I have been engaged by the city to provide some counsel and assistance in connection with this item, which is the designation of a significant corridor of land as a brownfield area under Florida statutes. We are actually going to designate a green reuse area to reflect that what we are attempting to do here is look forward and not look back to the past. But it's the past that brings us here today, because there are some significant environmental challenges associated with a number of the properties in this corridor. And these types of challenges historically have complicated redevelopment for both local governments and for the private sector. And in terms of the private sector, both for-profit entities and non-profit entities. And the state of Florida, the federal government through the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and Miami-Dade County have created a series of incentives, regulatory incentives, financial incentives, and technical incentives that are designed to encourage private parties and public parties to work together to cooperate to overcome environmental challenges that would otherwise be insurmountable. And historically, this program, which has been in existence for 20 years, has proven quite adept and successful in convincing parties to roll their sleeves up, work through what otherwise would be challenging, difficult, expensive, risky sites, and not turn away and perhaps pursue sites without these environmental issues that lie in the suburban fringe, exacerbating urban sprawl. And I know that's a significant goal that the city has, to compress development, to make it more logical, and to catalyze smart growth patterns that result in a series of social benefits and economic benefits to the city and to its taxpayers and to those who work, live, and play within the municipal limits. The purpose of this community meeting, it's our second community meeting, is to provide an opportunity to the community to ask questions about the designation, about the significance of the designation, about the opportunities associated with the designation, perhaps to voice any concerns that anyone might have about how the designation could work to their detriment. We don't think that's possible, but we're here to provide feedback and to educate, provide education about what we think is a very important program, and will play a key role in spurring the type of growth and investment and job creation that we would like to see in this particular corridor. Having said that, let's get into the program. And we begin at the beginning with the picture behind me, which is what was the classic understanding of what a brownfield was going back 10, 15, 20 years ago. That is, if you were in the private sector, if you were a lender, or even if you were part of the local government, and someone said, I have a property to redevelop, but there are some environmental issues, this is the type of picture that would immediately come to mind. A lot of buried drums, a lot of risk, a lot of cost, and so the proposition was literally cast in black and white. If any hint of environmental contamination existed, the default presumption was there was too much going on, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Let's go find a clean site somewhere on the suburban fringe where we don't have to deal with regulators and environmental lawyers and environmental consultants and budget overruns and insurance and dozens of other concerns that we'll go through over the course of this presentation. This next slide that I've put up on the screen brings us literally to today. Whereas 15 or 20 years ago, you could not give away a brownfield site if you wanted to. And we'll talk about what a brownfield site is in a moment, what it really means from a definitional perspective, from a statutory perspective. But turning to the end of the story, to the last page of the book, if you will, what we see now is if you have a piece of property that is in the right location, where the use that can be put to that site is one that has a sponsor, private sector or public sector, that site will sell and be redeveloped, can be redeveloped regardless of the environmental risk associated with it. So this picture that I have up on the screen before me is a screenshot, at least in the upper left-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, your upper right-hand corner, is a picture of the former People's Gas site going back about 50 years. This was where People's Gas engaged in manufactured gas production, which was a type of fuel used essentially to turn on streetlights and the like in the last century. This was a site that was severely contaminated, 17 acres, almost 18 acres, with a multi-million-dollar cleanup liability associated with it. But a developer came along last year, and with the assurances provided by the Florida Brownfields program, and given the market demand, ended up paying $21.14 million for this site. I put this up on the screen to validate the concept that environmentally challenged land can sell and does sell with the right incentives. And the right incentives exist today. They exist through the Florida Brownfields program. This is exactly why the city is designating such a broad corridor, in this particular corridor of Brownfield, to activate these incentives so that when developers and end users and not-for-profits and the local government, whether it's the city or the county, work together on a particular site for a particular use, when that particular site is discovered to have an environmental issue, and when that particular use is complicated by that environmental issue, all of the parties can have confidence that they can get through the program. They can work through the issues and the complications, and we see that with the most, even with the most extreme examples, like the one I have up on the screen before me. There is a reason why all of this is occurring, not just from an incentive perspective, not just from a legal perspective, but from on a more macro level. There are several cross-cutting development trends at play here that many observers are pointing out. And this next slide that I have up on the screen cuts to the quick of some of these development trends, maybe the most relevant one here in the city of Doral. This was a column that was written by a gentleman named David Brooks about 3 years ago. And he writes about a book written by two authors who collaborated on a very well-received article called The Metropolitan Revolution, Katz and Bradley. They describe a country that is segmenting slightly into divergent city-states. Demographically, society is clustering. In an area where the nuclear two-parent family was the key demographic unit, it made sense to think of America as a suburban economy with common needs. But now the two-parent nuclear families account for only a fifth of all households. The young, the old, and the single make up a huge slice of the population, and they flock to density. That's really the key takeaway point here. We have the opportunity to take advantage of the density, but in an urban community, density brings with it environmental challenges. We can solve those environmental challenges through the Florida Brownfields program. There's another point that's being made here in this article, and that is, even though the federal government, for political reasons, is becoming less energetic, city governments are becoming more so, and this city government in particular is 100% invested in the Florida Brownfields program and in helping private parties, including not-for-profits, work through environmental challenges to obtain success in the most efficient and cost-effective way possible. That is another reason why we think this Brownfields designation is so important, because this particular municipal government and this particular municipal staff is so expert and skilled at applying the incentives and assisting the developers and the community groups take advantage of the local incentives that exist, the federal incentives, and the state incentives. Let's now talk more specifically about what brownfields are and why there's such value here. Taking 2 steps back, I want to define what the term brownfield means, generically and from a statutory perspective. A brownfield is any type of real estate, publicly owned or privately owned, where redevelopment, reuse, or expansion, like rehabilitation or renovation, is complicated or made more challenging, more expensive, more burdensome, more time-consuming by actual or perceived contamination. And so the fact that we have 240 some acres here in this proposed corridor to be designated means that not all of the land will have actual contamination. Some of the land will simply have question marks associated with contamination that may be adjacent to a particular piece of property, or there may be some uncertainty related to a piece of property based on the former history, the former use of the property, that hasn't manifested itself in actual contamination, but could still complicate redevelopment, because a lender could likely say, well, you've got a gas station here. We know that gas stations typically are contaminated, and even though you don't have any actual documentation of a release of petroleum, we're still concerned. We don't think we want to lend on it, because we know that gas stations have all kinds of problems. We're going to lend on another piece of property where our borrower is not likely to fall into default as a result of having to pay for an expensive cleanup that was unbudgeted. The Florida Brownfields program helps with those types of properties as well, where the perception of contamination as opposed to actual contamination also complicates redevelopment. So these are the types of properties we're dealing with here. And historically, if you go back to the very first slide of this presentation and you look at that, or you look back into your mind's eye and you reflect on that picture of all of those drums, that was the classic take on an environmentally challenged site, regardless of the actual magnitude of contamination. Most people would walk away. Not so today. The reason why, there's such value associated with these sites. And the value only begins with the location of the property, right? That's the iron rule of real estate: location, location, location. If you look at this corridor, the way this corridor is situated along certain transit corridors, certain major thoroughfares, east and west and north and south and city of Doral, and where the city of Doral is located in the county, and all of the money coming into the city, standing alone, you've got location, 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 but within that corridor, you've got key real property assets that present tremendous intrinsic but locked up value as a result of all the challenges associated with actual or perceived contamination. Let's go deeper than location though. Why else is this program meaningful? Why else would a party want to assume the risk of acquiring, cleaning up, reusing a brownfield site? Well, we'll go through the bullet items really quickly. There's the ability to unlock the intrinsic use, location, and demographic value of a particular site. If you have a site off of 54th that's on the corner of a signalized intersection, and it's got an environmental history associated with it, again, maybe it was a gas station, maybe it was a dry cleaner, maybe it has a landfill component to it, and for decades it has essentially remained fallow and not utilized to its highest and best capacity. By going into the Brownfields program, getting comfortable with the incentives, comfortable with your liability, immediately, not only do you get to take advantage of the location, but you get to take advantage of whatever the zoning is. You get to take advantage of the demographic value of the site, all of the traffic that goes by, the east-west corridor, the north-south corridor, making it very valuable to a hotel user, to a retail user, to a residential user. That's part of the Brownfields proposition. The additional money that you can generate from that property by executing on the reuse, what the property is zoned for or what it can be rezoned for, creates an increment of profit that allows you to fund the cleanup. So now what looked to be insurmountable, what looked to be hopeless, is just the opposite. It's very promising. You're taking advantage of the incentives, you're getting comfortable with liability, you're actually available to redevelop it to its highest and best use. You're making a tremendous amount of money because of what's going on here in Doral. You take a component of that increment, you add it to the financial incentives that we're going to talk about in a second, and all of a sudden you've got a very viable funding mechanism that makes the whole process work. The second point, or the third point, is that you have a tremendous array, a buffet of incentives to choose from to make the project work. Tax credits, tax refunds, low interest loans, loan guarantees, grants from the federal government, grants from the state government, liability protection at the state level, liability assurances at the federal level, technical accommodations that may make your cleanup less expensive, less time consuming, less burdensome. And then we have a number of other points which I'm not going to go through in the interest of time. Suffice it to say that there's a lot here that makes these properties very attractive to those who understand how to take advantage of the incentives and the fact that they even exist, which again is why we're having this community meeting, to provide that type of outreach and education. Let's do a quick windshield survey of what's going on here in Miami-Dade County and why that enhances the value of this program. First, from a county oversight level, there is tremendous investment in the success of private sector capital going into challenged sites. Without the additional investment by the private sector, these sites would remain a public burden and would result in a tremendous expenditure of county funds for enforcement, which means litigation. That's not a productive way to bring about cleanup and change. The county would rather support and encourage, create a legal and regulatory framework that rewards the investment of private capital. So they're very supportive of this program, and Miami-Dade County has issued a series of guidance documents and protocols to streamline the cleanup process and further provide assurances to the private sector that if they do get involved with sites like those that exist in the corridor, they're not going to be punished. They're not going to end up in an endless loop of bureaucracy. That hasn't been our experience. In addition, there are certain regulatory and market trends that turbocharge the success and the efficiency and the efficacy of the Brownfields program at the federal, state, and local level. Some of those trends include what's going on from a real estate perspective here in Miami-Dade County. Affordable housing is one of the sectors that continues to perform very well. And accordingly, developers are spending a tremendous amount of money doing affordable housing, workforce housing, and mixed-use projects that combine market rate housing with affordable or workforce. And they have not been shy about pursuing sites that have environmental challenges because they understand that the incentives that exist will protect their investment and increase the bottom line. We see industrial users also investing heavily in brownfield sites. Old golf courses, landfills also make great canvases for industrial warehouse, for office warehouse, and the like. And not only are they developers looking for very large, contaminated, or environmentally uncertain properties, they like smaller canvases as well. There's a tremendous market in this county, actually throughout the state, for the former gas station. Some quick success stories before we get deeper into the program. This is one such industrial project that was built on a landfill. This is the Beacon Lakes site built by A&B Codina. It was one of the earliest brownfield projects in the county. We were involved with this site. This was a several hundred acre landfill, resulted in a very successful office warehouse park. It took advantage of state liability protection. It took advantage of a voluntary cleanup tax credit to recapture hundreds of thousands of dollars in cleanup costs. And it was the beneficiary of consolidated and expedited regulatory review by Miami-Dade County and by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. This is a hotel that went up in Sweetwater, built by the Procacci Company. Also on a landfill, the former Mark's dump site. It was both a landfill and a concrete plant. They built a Homewood Suites and a Hilton Garden complex, $35 million mortgage, which is a point that I want to make because lenders have gotten very comfortable with this program as a result of the liability protection that they get. This developer also received a tax credit for cleanup, which went directly to the bottom line, increasing the overall profitability of the project. Retail loves brownfield sites. We see a tremendous amount of retail development on golf courses, on landfills, on nursery sites, on old gas stations and dry cleaners and the like. This is a Walmart project that we were involved in. Not only did they get a cleanup tax credit for cleanup, but they got a tax refund from the state for job creation. The state wants to promote job creation on environmentally challenged sites. It's one of the main reasons we're doing this significant designation. Walmart received over $500,000 in tax refunds on this particular project. IKEA is a big consumer of brownfield sites. Home Depot, Target, Publix, the list goes on. I mentioned affordable housing a short while ago. We represent over a dozen affordable housing developers on brownfield sites all over the state. This was a project that was done in the Liberty City section of Miami-Dade County. Corinthian Apartments, it was built on an old junkyard. The developer took advantage not only of the voluntary cleanup tax credit, but a 100% sales tax refund on construction materials. This is a very significant environmental and economic incentive for significant projects that have budgets of $20, $30, $40, $50 million. It can result in a seven-figure cash refund back to the developer. Midtown Miami is an example that I include in this presentation because it's important to note that very high-end projects routinely use the Brownfields program. Historically, there has been some concern about stigma and property value. None of those concerns have proven out. We'll talk about that in a second. All of the empirical studies that have been done of the Florida and federal Brownfields program show that property values increase but not decrease when a designation and a cleanup are in place. Midtown Miami has involved over $500 million in development. The entire site is a designated brownfield area. It's taken advantage. The project has taken advantage of the sales tax refund on construction materials, the voluntary cleanup tax credit, the tax refund for job creation, and liability protection for both the developer and for the developer's lender. This is another business park that's being built. It's an office park and an industrial park on an old golf course not that far from here on 117th in unincorporated Miami-Dade County. This is a situation where we have arsenic in soil and in groundwater. The cleanup will be several $1 million over a period of years. The developer is taking advantage of the voluntary cleanup tax credit, the job bonus creation, significant state liability protection, and significant technical assistance from the county as a result of the property being in the Brownfield program. They are going to receive expedited reviews of all of their technical reports. It gets them through the program sooner than later, and that results in a significant savings. And this last example that I have up on the screen is actually three examples. One here in Doral, another in North Miami Beach, and a third in North Miami, where local governments have taken their own property into the Brownfields program for the purpose of cleaning up landfills and golf courses and other types of agricultural sites for the purpose of providing public assets like sports complexes and nature trails and conservation and recreation areas, large parks and both pocket parks. Okay. Long story short, it is prime time for contaminated land reuse. Lots of sites out there, over 1 million sites nationwide, covering over 15 million acres in the United States. We have strong institutional support from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, from the County Environmental Agency, and from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This is a mature, invested, and proven program, highly attractive to local government planning and economic development officials, as reflected by the additional incentives that are being incorporated here in the City of Doral. And the City of Doral Planning and Zoning Department favors the Brownfields program and understands not only how to work through environmental issues, but how to integrate environmental issues in development issues. Let's talk more objectively, because again, I want to drive home the point that this is a successful, mature program, one that has already been accepted by the business community. So we're not pioneering new ground here. We know what we're doing. The program knows what it's doing. And there's only upside for the development community and for community groups that want to repurpose environmentally challenged land challenged with actual or perceived contamination. Through September of this year, the end of September, there have been 436 designated brownfield areas, covering almost 267,000 acres in the state of Florida. The largest designated area that any one community approved was over 14,000 acres. Here we're only doing 240. And the smallest designation was for an old gas station site, 0.26 acres. 51 projects have successfully gone through the cleanup aspect of the program. SRCO stands for Site Rehabilitation Completion Order, and that's an administrative order that issues from the state and from the county when the cleanup has been certified as being complete. This type of work has resulted in over $2.7 billion in projected capital investment here in Florida alone, with 65,000 confirmed and projected new direct and indirect jobs coming out of the investment of private capital into environmental redevelopment projects. At the federal level, the numbers look very good as well. For every dollar that EPA invests in a site through a grant program, almost $18 in private sector money follows. So according to EPA, and they track this very closely, they have leveraged over $22 billion in private sector investment on brownfield sites. Now remember, at the top of this presentation, the story was 10, 15, 20 years ago, you couldn't give these sites away. Now you've got $22 billion in capital that's flowing into environmentally challenged properties. And we think we're going to see significant financial investment in this corridor once we effectuate the designation because of all the incentives that become available. I direct your attention to the third to the last bullet item on the screen. As a result of several objective studies that US EPA commissioned, they have determined that residential property values, for example, increase, not decrease, increase by 5.1% to 12.8% when brownfields are addressed through a program like this one that we're putting in place for this particular corridor. I'm going to scroll through some of these slides in order to get to the balance of the presentation in the interest of time, and then we'll take any questions. In Miami-Dade County, I mentioned earlier that DERM, the Environmental Pollution Control Agency, has worked very closely with the state of Florida and with local government stakeholders and developers to streamline the environmental redevelopment process. There are protocols that have been put in place to guide the way in which contaminated property is redeveloped to ensure that a private sector or public sector or for-profit or not-for-profit developer doesn't get sideways with any particular construction project on a contaminated site. There's a lot of money that's available, there's a lot of liability protection, but these are still risky projects because cleaning up contaminated soil and groundwater is risky, technical, and complicated business. Thankfully, there are, again, protocols that have been put in place at the state level and at the local level, and this next screen reflects some of those protocols that have been put in place to guide the types of professionals that one would want to hire to work on environmentally challenged projects like those that exist in this corridor. So, if you are going to be involved in actual redevelopment, you're going to want to hire a consultant who will know how to prepare a soil management plan, a construction to watering plan, an air monitoring plan, a waste relocation plan, and a health and safety plan. These are key components to any redevelopment project. Let's talk about why this is so important. This is so important because even a slight miscalculation or misunderstanding of what one is dealing with on a contaminated piece of property can result in a significant budget overrun that could make a project unfeasible after the parties have already committed significant capital, after a loan is in place. The slide I have up on the screen shows what the incremental costs of construction can be at a particular type of contaminated site where you start to take soil out of the ground and export it off-site for development purposes, which is something that one would typically do to get development started. Development typically requires, at the outset, the removal of a certain volume of topsoil where the property hasn't been developed previously. If that certain volume of topsoil is contaminated with arsenic, which happens a lot in Miami-Dade County because that's a naturally occurring chemical, and that number hasn't been properly budgeted, the cost of disposal increase significantly very, very quickly. For example, on a 5-acre site, that's the second column, moving to the right of the slide, size of the site, 5 acres. If you have contaminated soil in the first 1-foot interval, it could easily cost just over $900,000 to remove that soil and dispose of it at a properly licensed landfill. And then it would cost almost $500,000 to replace that soil with clean soil. It's an expensive proposition if you don't properly budget for it on the front end. But even if you do properly budget for it on the front end and you know what that cost is going in, how do you offset it to make that project worthwhile? We're going to talk about that in a second because the incentives exist. The economic incentives exist, and that's really the heart and soul, the lifeblood of the Florida Brownfields program. It provides a lot of money for remediating contaminated sites and otherwise making them available for redevelopment. I'm going to actually scan ahead to those slides right now, and then we'll come back to some of these other slides that deal with the federal Brownfields program. Economic incentives. Okay, let's talk about the economic incentives that exist at the state level. This slide is a one-pager that captures all of the money that can be available for any type of project in that corridor once the designation is approved. First, you've got tax credits. Voluntary cleanup tax credits, these are corporate income tax credits that are generated as a function of how much money you spend in a given year on cleanup. If you spend $1 million in a given year on cleanup, you'll ultimately get back 75% of that in Florida corporate income tax credits, or $750,000. If you build affordable housing or you provide health care, that number jumps up to 100%. So on a $1 million cleanup, it's conceivable that you could get back 100% of that money in Florida corporate income tax credits. For developers who can't use those corporate income tax credits, they can be sold on the secondary market and they're generating 90 cents on the dollar. So on a $1 million cleanup, you can generate between 67.5% cash back on a 75% corporate income tax rate, or 90% back on a 100% corporate income tax rate. There are also tax refunds as reflected in this one-page summary. $2,500 per full-time job created. So if in this corridor we bring in a significant user, a significant employer, and they create 100 new jobs on a retail site or a new corporate headquarters, for every 100 new jobs created, they are going to receive back from the state of Florida $250,000 in cash. And that would be on top of the amount of money that was generated for the cleanup. So if you have a cleanup and you're creating jobs, it's possible to actually make money on the environmental component of the redevelopment project. And then on top of that, if you're doing affordable housing as part of your mixed use, you're going to get back a sales tax refund on construction materials. I believe I have a slide on that. Here we go. So let me wrap up by talking with a little more specificity about the economic incentives. We talked about the tax refund. We talked about the tax credit. We talked about the sales tax refund on construction materials. The Florida Brownfields program also provides for a liability protection. If you are a developer, if you are an end user, if you are a community group and you want to take title to a contaminated site, the state of Florida wants to protect you. And so once you enter into a brownfield cleanup agreement, you will be absolutely protected from any third-party action for cost recovery, for property damage, and not only will you be protected, but your lenders will be protected. That makes the property that much more transactable, okay? It's been proven that those incentives alone, the financial component at the state level, the liability component at the state level, plus the regulatory accommodations that you get, the favorable treatment, the quicker reviews of plans and reports, the dedicated administrative support you get from highly specialized engineers within the county environmental bureaucracy. All of that has proven to be successful in bringing these projects quickly and predictably through the cleanup process, providing assurances and comfort to the development community that these promises are meaningful. We think that the program will have the same type of success in this corridor that we've experienced everywhere else in the state. Separate and apart from the state incentives and the local incentives, there are federal incentives for especially difficult sites that have federal liability. US EPA also brings money to the table through the form of grants and low interest loans and liability protection and administrative support. We have found that to be successful as well, although to my knowledge I don't think we have any single facility or property within this corridor that we're proposing to be designated that's under federal enforcement now. But if, for whatever reason, it's discovered at some point in the future that the federal government needs to be involved, their Brownfield staff would also participate in helping us work through the environmental challenges. Let's talk a little bit about the process now. In order to designate this corridor a brownfield under Chapter 376.80 Florida statutes, we have to have 2 public hearings before the City Council. We've had 1. We're going to have 1 more on November 15th. We're required to conduct a significant amount of community outreach and public notice, which we've done through publication in the newspaper, posting along the corridor, announcing at earlier City Council meetings. We've published notice of this designation on the city website, and we are having a series of community meetings, which is actually above and beyond what the statute requires. There are 4 criteria that the local government must consider in order to designate the site a brownfield. And interestingly enough, the state gives the municipality a tremendous amount of discretion. No particular finding is required. These factors simply need to be considered. The City Council considered those factors at first hearing favorably. They were disposed to effectuate the designation at the first public hearing. Second public hearing is required, and we don't think that there's going to be any issue once the item comes before the council again at the second hearing. So with that, I think I'm going to conclude my presentation, and if there are any questions, we're happy to entertain them. Have I filibustered completely?
Very thorough.
Thank you so much, Mike. A very, very good presentation. Again, the item is going on second reading on November 15th. There is a staff report as well as a resolution associated with this item. The staff report is very detailed. It kind of walks you through the process. It responds to each of the criteria that Mike had mentioned. And then in addition to that, there's also attachments to the staff report, including the page that showed all the incentives. So I urge you to please take a look at it. And if you have any further questions, you're more than likely, you can call the department or please attend the second reading of the item. We'll be there, and we're always available to answer any questions regarding the program. One last thing, in terms of the voluntary cleanup tax credits, the city has been very successful in the last 2 years, thanks to Mr. Goldstein, as well as the team that we have in-house, in being able to secure almost $700,000 for the city on voluntary cleanup tax credit on 2 sites. Over $500,000 for the Doral legacy cleanup, as well as another $100 and something thousand for the former FP&L site.
What is the
that.
former, thing?
That's the location that is behind the police station. That's an area that was bought by the city about 3 years ago. It was used for stormwater discharge, and now we own the property. A portion of the property has been used for stormwater discharge. The other portion is going to be a passive park. That is going to be.
Doral Glades Park, is that?
No, Doral Glaze is okay. The one that we had some environmental challenge was Doral Legacy. And again, that one we have been able to secure over $500,000 in voluntary tax credit. So the program works, and we're a prime example. But again, it's making sure that you have the right guidance, the right group of professionals working, and that's one thing that we have here at the city going on for us. It's a very, very, very good program, and I think it provides protection to all the parties involved. Again, with that, it's November 15th, and that will be our second reading. That meeting starts at 6 o'clock. It's upstairs in the third floor chamber.
This is a very effective tool now in the toolbox for the city, for the development community, for community groups, and I want to emphasize that the program is available not only to for-profit developers, but to not-for-profits as well, to community groups, to community advocates, to neighborhood organizations that may want to repurpose, let's say, an abandoned gas station as an art installation or as a public gathering place.
2057.
And now they can do so even more.
Bank.
Right. That's right. And so we are asking for your help in getting the word out to the potential users of this program that once this incentive program has been adopted, it is ready to go on day one. We think it's going to result in better development, more job creation, the type of development that the city wants to see. Smart growth, development that has sustainability at its core, that takes into account not only the acceleration of contamination remediation, but the implementation of sound stormwater management practices and utilizing the type of green infrastructure necessary to make sure that when we allow for on-site retention of stormwater, we're not taking a situation where we've got contaminated soil or groundwater and making it worse. We're doing just the opposite as a result of some of the technical incentives that are available through this program on top of the financial incentives.
Yeah, and another thing about the program is this program is also part of a series of other programs that we have available in the city. We probably have one of the most advanced low-impact development master plan in the state that's also becoming part of the comprehensive plan. So we look at this program. We also look at the housing master plan that we're working on too. And by the way, we have a community meeting coming up next Monday to present the results of the data collection and so forth. So everybody's invited to that. But again, it's one of several programs that we have going on in the city to facilitate redevelopment. One of a very important component of this program is that this program is also an economic development tool. And we see it as one of many tools that we like to have in our toolbox that we want to make available to developers and non-developers as part of the redevelopment phase of the city that is now moving forward. With that, if there's no questions, we'd like to bring this meeting to a closure. And again, thank you, Michael, very, very much for your presentation. Very informative and very educational. And thank you to everybody that's here today.